Welcome to another episode of the Harder to Breathe podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Dusick. I was the founding drummer of Maroon 5, but I'm now a licensed therapist, author, and mental health advocate. With me, as always, is my co-host, Duck Maylard. How you doing, Duck?
No, I'm sore. The Little League season has begun anew, and we had our first practice, and my whole body is rebelling against me. So my shoulder is sore from throwing, and my quad is sore from stretching, and I didn't stretch, so... but it's a wonderful time of year. I love when Little League Baseball starts up again, but I'm paying the price for it.
Why do you think it is that you didn't stretch?
Because I'm old and I forget to stretch, and, I think to myself, it's just little, like the kids are the ones running around, but I forget that I throw 1,000, ground balls and I'm swinging a bat, and by the end it's too late. So I'll remember for the next practice to stretch a little bit more. But other than that, I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. I've been keeping busy. Since I finally passed that exam and got fully licensed, I've been just in the process of a lot of administrative stuff, getting my personal business as a therapist up and running and everything.
Right.
And we've been kind of in full swing with this second season of the show, and so doing both those things at the same time, my calendar's been filling up pretty quick.
Yeah, your dance card is full. I had something I wanted to share that I literally just thought of, and I hesitate often to when we do these intros to kind of bring up the recurring issue of my ennui of my career, the ebbs and flows of I'm not working and I feel bad about myself and maybe I should do a new thing. So I won't bore our listeners with that common refrain. However, I will say that I share that with my family sometimes, and even my son, he's 11, and it's sometimes heavy to be like, "What's the matter, Dad?" And be like, "Well, Dad doesn't know if his career is, like it's not stuff you want to lay on your kid, but I do because he's a a pretty mature kid." And I came into my office the next day or whatever, and I've got this Post-it note that I covered up my camera because I don't want the government spying on me, and I saw that he wrote on it. I don't know if you can see it. He wrote, "This is a reminder from Beckett to keep living life." Like my beautiful little kid who is so sensitive and so attuned to it when his dad's having a rough time. He leaves me little notes. He's done it for years. I look on the bottom of my keyboard and there's a note here that says, "Love and calm." This is like 5-year-old scrawl from a little kid. Love and calm. So I've got a real I got a good one there who looks after me and who's really in tune with my own mental state and kind of brings me back to what's important. So I thought that was a nice thing to share for everybody.
That's beautiful. You've got a little empath growing.
Right? Yeah. Yeah. But I will say one thing I am very frustrated at is that we ask at every episode, we say, if you've got a question or you've got a comment, drop us a line at hardertobreathepodcast@gmail.com. And no one ever does. Ryan, why won't anyone ask us questions?
To be specific, we've had questions on Instagram, on our pages there, on YouTube, and you're right. I do tend to just answer them right away. I don't stop to think, maybe we should just answer that on the show. Because we've been waiting for people to literally write us a letter
to do it the
or
right
email.
way.
The old-fashioned way. I think our minds are thinking in old-fashioned terms, and that's why we haven't been able to do that yet. However, we finally have gotten a little bit of actual old-fashioned fan mail with some questions, and so I want to take this opportunity. I know you're excited to answer fan questions. So I got a couple different fans reaching out through my website, ryandusick.com, and one of them is a guy named Chris from Clarksville, Arkansas. He originally reached out to me through my website, and this was mind-boggling to me when I read this. Because, obviously we get a lot of people saying, I'm a Maroon 5 fan. That's pretty typical how they find the show. But this new friend of ours, Chris, says he was a huge fan of Maroon 5 when I was in the band, and that you, Brian Maylard, are his favorite and one of the greatest voiceover actors of all time.
Hey! I love this guy.
And then the two of us, you and I, independent of one another, had an enormous impact on his childhood in a positive way.
Crazy.
Isn't that weird?
Yeah. Although I'm a little offended that you're I was surprised to find that someone actually enjoyed your career, Duck. I couldn't. How dare you, sir? I
That's not
shaped
the part I'm
minds
surprised at.
I know.
I'm just surprised that there was an intersection between those two things and that he
Right.
recognized it. Because it's like, how many people are there out there, let's be honest, that look up who did the voice of a
Right.
character on.
Well, to be fair, the anime, because this gentleman was a fan specifically of the kind of the Pokemon Ninja Turtles era of my career, and those fans are dedicated. They go to the conventions, they go to signings, they love the world, the kind of behind the scenes stuff. So I'd say probably a lot more than you would expect. They know all the ins and outs of that world.
Got it. Okay. Well, I'm showing my ignorance there because it's not a world
okay.
that I have a lot of familiarity with. But so basically, what happened was he asked this new friend of ours, Chris from Arkansas, asked if he could send us an old-fashioned fan letter and have us sign some autographs and send them back. And I got a thing in the mail with a return envelope and all this stuff to sign. It's, if you can see, it's like an old 8x10 of Cars Flowers and the cover of the Maroon 5 record. Bunch of your stuff, as you mentioned, the Pokemon and all the different stuff from that era of your voiceover work, and then 2 letters which you haven't even seen in person yet.
I haven't, but
yeah, one to me and one to you. Reiterating his appreciation of both of us and our different backgrounds, and then questions for each of us individually, which I've shared with you. And so let's do it, man. Let's answer his questions. We're going to send him a letter and send him all the autographs and stuff too, but let's do it here too.
Yeah. All right. I'm going to go first because let's be honest, people want to hear some Maroon 5 questions. So his first question, and this is one you've probably been asked many times before, as he says, but what is the story behind This Love? One of Maroon 5's biggest hits, earliest hits.
Yeah, it was our first big hit. I think it was in 2004. It was the number 2 most played song in America of that year, behind only. Can you guess? Can you guess what the number 1 most played song?
What year was
2004? 2004.
2004. God, I have no idea. I was so not listening to popular music at that time. I don't know. You tell me.
It was Usher. Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's not the answer to the question, just context. This Love was one of the last songs that we wrote for Songs About Jane. We had written the majority of the album, including what we figured were going to be the singles. The band thought that the first single was probably going to be Not Coming Home. That was the song that we had the most excitement about, which of course ended up being like track 11 and not really a consideration for a single. That's how much, the artist knows.
What do you guys know exactly
about commerciality? But we thought that was our first single. We thought that Sunday Morning was going to be the sort of crossover, more top 40 kind of pop song, and that She Will Be Loved would be the big soccer mom ballad.
Emotional ballad. Soccer mom.
That was the way the record label put it to us. Is like that's the third single. That's when when the soccer moms are blasting your ballad. That's when you've really So that's what we thought, and we're like, okay, well, put us in the studio. We're ready to go. Let's do this. But the record label was doing what record labels do, and they're like, well, let's just do a couple more writing sessions, a few more demos. I think we might have one more. Let's just see if maybe we get one more like sure thing, slam dunk hit. And we're like, oh, come on, man. These songs are already a sure thing. We're ready. And they're like, just humor us. So we really were just humoring them. We really didn't have any intention of going in and saying, let's try to write the biggest hit ever. We were just like, let's hammer out a few things. We'll take the last remnants of little bits that we haven't been able to finish and turn into songs. We have a few riffs laying around. Let's just use those and appease them and do one more demo session, and then we'll be able to go in the studio and make the record. Famously, where Rage Against the Machine recorded all of their stuff live. Nice. They did their second album and third album there, I think, which was a big moment when Adam and I heard them rehearsing next door. And first we thought it was a cover band. We were loading in amps, and we heard like Killing in the Name or Freedom or something, and we're like kind of looking at each other like, oh, there's a band like us messing around playing Rage Against the Machine songs. Yeah. And then all of a sudden we hear Zach's voice, and we looked at each other, we're like, oh my God! And we started jumping up and down and hugging each other. It's them! Anyway, that has nothing to do with this love. Um, so we have this writing session. We had like a riff that was like a part of Not Coming Home that had gotten cut out, and we were like, let's try to make a song out of that, a secondary riff. We had this piano part that was kind of a Dr. Dre inspired thing that Jesse had come up with, and one other part. So we worked on those three songs and just kind of like tried to tack on B sections and have Adam throw a melody and lyric on it. Now, Harder to Breathe was in that session, which was inspired because that was the riff that came from Not Coming Home, and it had more of an aggressive kind of attitude to it. And Adam wrote the lyric about the record label breathing down our neck.
Right.
And so it was it was our FU song, FU to the label. This Love, though, however, was an afterthought, and it was just this piano riff that Jesse had a progression that was kind of very straight. It was like blam, 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 ba-da, blam, 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 blah, da, da. And then I think I had the idea of making it funky, adding that little bit of a swing to it, like that. And so then we all kind of like looked at each other and was like, this is kind of grooving now. And then Adam like runs to the couch and he picks up his pad and he just starts scribbling down. And right in the middle of this was the context. Of course, the album's called Songs About Jane. Adam was in this on again, off again, hot and cold relationship with a real girl named Jane, who literally had just left on a plane for New York the day before, I think. And it was like, we're breaking up and we're never getting back together. It was like going to be the end of the relationship. And so he was obviously in the midst of something tumultuous, not just with the record label, but in his own personal romantic life. We didn't know yet that the album was going to be called Songs About Jane or that was the theme of it, but there were several songs in that vein. And it just so happened that lightning kind of struck that day, and he put all of that emotion into that song, which to me ended up being the culmination of that whole cycle of songs that was about the experience of a doomed relationship, all the love and lust and optimism, and then all the heartbreak and regret and everything that goes along with a breakup. And it just happened to all kind of fit right into that song. And as fate would have it, those two songs became the first two songs on the album and the first two singles, and really sort of like the pulse and the heartbeat that set the tone for the rest of the album. So you never know where inspiration is going to come from, and you never know, even when we were just kind of doing it reluctantly, it ended up being fortuitous. I'm sure people have heard that story before, but I mean, it really was one of those things where we didn't even hear it then until the mixes were finished and stuff, and the label was like, those are the singles, and we're like, we'll see. And then they were right. What can I say?
It's funny to me because it's also what I kind of think epitomizes the Maroon 5 sound. It's that kind of singer-songwriter vibe with that funky backbeat, so I think it's so interesting that it was not an afterthought, but I think of your first album as songs. Some of those songs, like you say, were Kara's Flowers songs. They'd been around for years. Not one that you like went in and like forced to like, all right, now we're going to write a song, because that never works. When I sit down and go, I'm going to write a song, I never do. I only write a song when I have a riff that pops up in my head, and over the course of weeks, I like sit at the piano and work on it. So it's interesting to me when the song comes together like that. Did anyone ever compare or say that it's reminiscent of Moving Out by Billy Joel? I always thought that piano riff was similar to the doom 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 doom.
We were definitely listening to a lot of Billy Joel, and I remember even one night we used to go to this really hipster kind of club in Hollywood called Le Doux at the time, and Mickey used to DJ there, and I remember one night him blasting Moving Out, which was like a weird thing for a hipster to do, was to blast Billy Joel. It was like ironic, and then everyone was like, yeah, at the same time, to bring the Usher song back. That was definitely in our sort of it was in the zeitgeist in that moment. However, no one ever said that, but what they did say was the Foreigner song Cold as Ice, I think.
Sure.
that was something people, and we were like, that's interesting because we were not listening to that song when we wrote This Love.
Foreigner, not a big Maroon 5 influence.
Yeah. All right. So now it's time for a question for you.
Yeah, let's speed
Brian
run. Okay,
Maylard.
here we go. Ready.
So here's your number one question. What inspired you to be a voice actor?
Well, it's going to sound cheesy, like I'm trying to tie it into this show, but it actually has a lot to do with what we talk about on this show. So I was always doing voices and stuff growing up. I loved cartoons, Looney Tunes, Chuck Jones. My sister and I were devotees. But I never knew of it as a career until I got to New York and I was doing theater. And then I started experiencing anxiety and having the difficulty of being on stage performing in front of people. I managed to book a voiceover somewhere, and I realized, oh, I can stand in a booth, but with not have to perform for anybody. I can wear whatever I want to wear. If I mess up, I can just do a second take. So a lot of it was literally born from my anxiety, because I realized that it was one of the ways I could still continue to work without having to deal with the issues that came up. So that was the initial part of it. Then it was, I was good at it, and I could do a lot of character voices and make funny. I was always born I had a very low voice from a very young age. I was in high school and I sounded like this. I was always born. And so like I would show up to jobs where I was the announcer, going to be doing like, buy now with a very low 2.9% APR. And they didn't know it was me in the waiting room. I was like a kid with a skateboard. I would skateboard to sessions in New York. And they're like, we thought you were like the delivery guy. I was like, no, I'm your voiceover announcer. So it was a fun, that was how I got into it initially. And now it's a great part of my career. But a lot of it stemmed from the very anxiety that spurned the idea for this show.
It's funny. I always fancied myself somebody who could kind of throw my voice and do like impressions of just sounds of people's voices and do funny things with my voice. And I always thought, I think I could be a good voiceover actor. And then of course you meet somebody who is a real voiceover actor and who actually has a real talent for those things. And I'm like, oh, okay. That's just like, armchair quarterback, thinking
Sure.
I don't know. I mean, I hesitate on this show to ever do voices because it's going to pale in comparison to you do. I like do an impression of someone and then you do like a real impression of it. So it's a testament to your talent. And I don't know if that's something you honed over time or if it was something that you just
I just had an ear for it. It's same thing with accents and things. Like I didn't study those things. I was just always able to kind of do it. A lot of it came from like watching Monty Python and stuff when I was a kid. So I learned how to do different British accents because they do accents from all over, London and things like that. But it's okay because you know what? I do weak impressions of being a therapist on this show, and then you come in and actually hit us with so we both do it. We both kind of fancy ourselves the amateur version of the other one's profession. So I think that's okay. Let me ask you a second question because this will take forever if we expound on these answers this long. This is just a question that I think listeners from the very beginning already know the answer, but we can still address it. How did you and Duck meet? And is it a coincidence that you both played an extremely huge part in 2000s culture?
Right.
That's a big question for you to answer, but
yeah, I'll try to get to the point. You and I met probably almost about 20 years ago now through a mutual friend, a family friend of mine. It's almost like a cousin, somebody I've known my whole life. That you happened to go to college with at Ithaca College and introduced us. And we also, you had another friend from Ithaca College that you were playing music with in a band and who asked me to produce a demo first for that band. And so that was when I don't know if we'd probably met a few times at Jolie's house before that. Yeah, before that. But that was then we engaged, in a process together when we did that first demo where we got to know each other better as people and as creative people. And then, of course, that ended up being a relationship that lasted a few years where I was producing stuff and sort of managing the band and helping develop things. So that's how the relationship started. And obviously much later in that relationship, we started this podcast. So that was like the original formation, but our relationship has evolved over time. Right. The second part of the question was, was it just a coincidence that we both Did what?
And well, I think it's overstating my impact on the culture of the mid 2000s. I think my voiceover career and Maroon 5 are not on the same level of cultural importance, but it's just, I think, a question about like, you
Right.
know, what are the odds, right?
Well, I think it's a coincidence. I mean, look, we had different backgrounds and we did our own things before we met each other. And I had already done the whole Maroon 5 thing, and you had already been in that world of voice acting before we met. I don't think it's a coincidence that we met because we're both creative people and we had connections to other creative people.
Right.
And that's how we ended up in the same circle. Yeah, but they were totally separate things. We just both had backgrounds that came together. I suppose, yeah, it is a coincidence.
But I think, like you say, it's cool that like-minded people find each other, and I think that whether it's coincidence or whether it's fate or whatever it is, we did find each other, and now here we are doing a show together, which is a cool kind of bookend. So,
Question number
all
two.
right, let's
Brian.
power through this last question because
Yeah. Well, there actually are two more questions on here for you, but should I just choose one, or should we do both of them quickly?
Put them together because I know the
All right.
questions are you, so and I can answer them quick.
Who has been your favorite character to voice? My favorite has been Drake.
Oh yeah,
And then
Drake.
what was it like working with Van Green, Veronica Taylor, and Eric Stewart?
Okay, so my favorite characters were my favorite character back in the 4Kids TV day, which is what this gentleman was a fan of, was a show called One Piece. I played a character named Chopper, who was a reindeer who could change forms. So there was 3 actors who played the different. So when Chopper was a little baby reindeer, he had like a little girl voice, and then he was like medium Chopper, and he was like, "Hey, I'm kind of spindly," and then I played big ultimate hulked out Chopper, and he talked like this, and every line was like this, and when I'd finish the voiceover session, my throat was completely chewed. So it was a bad decision to make that voice. That, and then also the show that I just finished a few years ago called Amphibia, where I played Loggle, who was he was a woodworking axolotl. And that was a great experience working on a Disney show. The answer to the other question is an unfortunate answer that I didn't have any experience working with those people because the world of voiceover, you're typically in a booth by yourself. You know, there are very few shows that record live with multiple people in the room where you get to hang out and know each other. So I would literally go into a session and I'd do a voice, and then they'd go, "Hey, can you come over here and do this voice real quick for this show?" And I'd be like, "Sure." And suddenly I was on Pokemon, and that's how I did Drake, So it wasn't as romantic and wonderful as some people sometimes hope it was. It was still cool, don't get me wrong, but I didn't have a ton of interaction with people. I only have a few friends that I still know from that time because they would be like voice directors as well. They'll do voices, like a guy like Sam Riegel that a lot of people know, who has a great show, The Legend of Vox Machina and Critical Role, things like that. But anyway, thank you so much for the awesome questions. It feels so great.
Yeah.
It feels like we're validated our existence as a real show.
Well, this is awesome for me, both because it's great to have fans out there who are now starting to engage and to be able to do this on the show. But also, I wasn't that aware of this part of your IMDb page.
Yeah.
And so to hear you talking about that, I was like, I guess I need to brush up on my...
It's something that I don't do as much of now, just because when I moved to LA, it's a whole different world. The voiceover world in LA was harder to break into. I had a much more difficult time. I had more successful in New York. And so I've only been kind of back into it in recent years with that show Amphibia on Disney Channel and doing, radio and video games and stuff. So it isn't as big a part as doing on-camera stuff, but it's still there, and it's a great gig if you can get it.
Yeah. Well, thank you again, Chris from Arkansas. Did we say thank
Chris
you?
from
Yes.
Arkansas.
Yeah, this was great. And I hope that answered your questions. Send us more questions. You can reach out to me through my website, ryandusick.com, or you can send an email directly to hardertobreathepodcast@gmail.com. That's a great way to reach us.
If we had merch, we'd send it to you.
Yeah,
We
we'll
don't
get
have
there.
any yet. Yeah.
Yeah. And then we'll get so big that we won't have the time to respond to every single email. That's
So stop sending us questions.
Yeah, we're going to go through the whole cycle. So we have actually a really awesome conversation today with a great guest. His name is Shawn O'Malley. He is one one of the hosts of the biggest investor podcast in the country, the Investors Podcast Network. And he's a young guy. He's only 26 years old, and he's successful and very knowledgeable. But also, what we learned in this conversation, which you'll hear in just a second, is that he just has a lot of self-awareness and maturity, I think, for any age, but certainly for somebody in their 20s.
Yeah. He's
been through a lot of things, and he's learned a lot about himself, and he speaks articulately, as I don't, about those things. And so I just thought it was a really great conversation. I'm excited for everyone to hear it. Anything else you want to add?
No, I agree. I think, if you're like me and you go through podcast titles and you go, oh, that's something interesting I want to hear about, you might look at this and go, what are they going to talk about finance, with this guy? But it literally transcends that whole thing, because it's such a great conversation about mental health and about his journey and his awareness of how to overcome those things. So the context is almost unimportant window dressing, because it's just a really great 1-to-1, well, 2-to-1, because you and I, 2-to-1 conversation about mental health and about his journey. So I think you're going to enjoy it.
All right. Well, without any further ado, here's our conversation with Shawn O'Malley right here on the Harder to Breathe podcast. Shawn O'Malley, welcome to Harder to Breathe.
Thanks for having me on.
This is cool. We were introduced just recently by a mutual friend, Chris Panayotou, who I've known for maybe 2 years now. I think you have as well, and he's been a guest on the show. And it's interesting. We've had a few people in the investment world on the show, including Chris, and it is kind of like I'll be honest, it's a stretch for Duck and me, because Duck and I are kind of like, we're creative types. We're from a performance background. Duck is an actor. I was a musician. I'm now a therapist. We talk about our feelings a whole lot, right? In general and on this show. And sometimes having people in the investment world on, it's a much more sort of cut and dry. It's about business. It's about taking action, getting things done.
Facts and figures.
And here you are, another person in the investment world, a successful guy, successful podcast in the Investors Podcast. I'm curious to hear, just to get things kind of rolling for you. You heard about this through Chris, the Harder to Breathe podcast. What was it that interested you in coming on a show that talks about feelings?
I take a lot of pride in the fact that I'm probably more in touch with my emotional side than your average finance bro. I think they get a bad,
which is to say, at all,
rap.
in touch at all.
Yeah. But I have always had a very sensitive, kind of vulnerable side that I haven't been afraid to tap into. And it's helped that I've done a lot of therapy over the years to make those emotions more accessible. But but I think I realized pretty quickly that when I was in college, so I'm 26, and when I was in college, I had these grand dreams of I'm going to work on Wall Street, I'm going to be this titan of industry, and maybe not be a psychopath, but just be cold-blooded, I don't want to say killer, but you know what I mean, really make a lot of money and do a lot of really cool stuff in New York. And for a variety of reasons I'm sure we'll talk about today, I really very quickly realized that is not who I am. And that is not the life I had cut out for me. And so then, I guess it's not a surprise that I'm a podcaster too now, right? And so even though my kind of passion and interest is investing in finance, I'm kind of a commentator. I'm not really a player on the court. And those are very different mindsets. So, I don't know. I think I have a lot to do still on kind of working through emotions and processing emotions better, but I'm the type of person who prioritizes that a lot. And I would say that's also maybe why I'm somebody who is not having a successful career on Wall Street right now.
Well, you know what? It's funny that you say that, because I often think about the shortcomings in my own career in terms of the skill sets that I don't possess that might make me a more successful actor. So, for example, the attention to detail of we've talked about it in the past, sending out headshots and emails and things to agents and managers every month, and being on top of the business side of it. And it's just never been my strong suit. And I often think maybe if I was better at that, I'd be more successful. And so it's interesting that it isn't just actors are emotional and finance bros are analytical. There's got to be a little bit of both that creep into both worlds. And to a certain extent, your ability to do those things might have an impact on your success level.
Yeah, I mean, I'm biased, but I think having a creative backdrop and kind of some of the emotional side that comes with it is actually a real asset in investing. Aswath Damodaran is he's a professor at NYU, and he's known as the dean of valuation. He's a very, very well-respected guy. And his whole thing about valuing companies and thinking about how businesses will do in the future is that you can't just put numbers in a spreadsheet and just call it a day and say this company's going to grow profits by 5% a year. Well, what is the story of why? Why is Facebook going to be a bigger business in 5 years from now than today? And you have to have somewhat of a creative oriented mind to envision a different version of the future, where a company is bigger or more influential or more profitable. And so I mean, I can't tell you how many people I met who are like very quantitative minded, and they think finance is all quantitative, and they're like wizards in Excel and programming, but there's no vision, there's no storytelling, there's no creative thinking, there's no writing ability. And so most of the work they do is useless because they're not able to imagine a different version of the future. And I think fundamentally, that is kind of what it means to be creative, is to imagine a different version of reality than currently exists. So I consider myself to be kind of a writer by nature. For a lot of the work that I do involves creative writing, which you might kind of be surprised to hear, but it definitely does. And so I do think that is like an important asset that I try to cultivate, is my ability to think creatively and tap into emotions of like, hey, I just had an awesome experience in Airbnb. And like emotionally, I walked away from it. Maybe Airbnb isn't a good business today, but I can imagine why it'll be a good business in a few years from now. So I think it's a real disadvantage to turn off your emotions in the world that I work in, at least. And I try to lean into it.
We talked a bit with Chris when he was on the show about the difference between quantitative and qualitative thinking. I mean, I've heard those terms being a therapist and studying at the grad school level, just in terms of research and data. Quantitative meaning numbers, crunching numbers, things that are hard data, and qualitative meaning the qualities, the soft data. When it comes to that in terms of finance and your experience in giving good financial advice for people and their futures, whether it's on the company level or on the individual level, do you find that there's a shift, or for you, let's begin with, in terms of where the priorities are? Because historically, I think, money people think about numbers and goals, and are you meeting those numbers? Are you meeting those goals? And the feeling people like me and Duck tend to think about, how do I feel? And am I meeting my personal goals? Are my relationships? Do you see for you that there's more intersection between those things than maybe the finance world has thought about in the past?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think Chris mentioned the idea of behavioral finance, and that's something I think about a lot. And one of the unspoken realities of the investment world, and I'm not a financial planner in the way that Chris is, and so a lot of what I do is focus, specifically stock investing, and like focusing on companies and studying them and trying to figure out what companies are going to do the best over the next 5 or 10 years, so you can own them. But the first thing I tell everybody is, this is a hobby for me. This is a passion project. I find it really, really interesting to think about how the world is going to change and evolve, and what that will mean for different companies and the people who run those companies. To me, that's like the ultimate chess, or ultimate puzzle. Like that's what I get a lot of intellectual stimulation out of. But if you look at the numbers, it's pretty straightforward. The vast majority of people who try to do stock investing, especially day trading, but really any kind of investing, will underperform basically the industry benchmark. And the industry benchmark is the S&P 500, which is just this like index of the 500 biggest companies in America. So for like basically no cost, you could go out and you could get like a mutual fund or an ETF, and through that you would own the 500 biggest and best companies in the world. And so that's a really hard benchmark to beat. That's like, it's like LeBron James as your investing benchmark. And then you have all these like street ball players trying to go up and compete with him. And the reality, like I said, is the vast majority of people who the vast majority of people who try to go and pick stocks and invest are not going to beat the LeBron of investing, the S&P 500. And I don't really have any illusions that I will either. Like I said, I do it because it's interesting. And if I can make a lot of money out of it and beat industry benchmarks and all that great stuff, then I think that's a good thing to do. But like I said, I appeal to people in the very specific niche of like they fully understand that the odds are stacked against them, but they still want to go for it anyways, for no other reason that life is short and they think this is fun and they want to do it because it's fun. But I mean, all my friends and stuff, I'm constantly telling them, like, you don't know what you're doing. I barely know what I'm doing. You don't know what you're doing. Stop doing what you're doing. Stop trying to pick companies. Stop buying options. Stop day trading. You do not understand what you're doing, and just go buy a mutual fund and minimize the fees and costs as much as possible, and go focus on what you're actually passionate about. Earn your 9%. Yeah, exactly. Because we're all passionate about different things, and I don't think a lot of people put probably way too much thought into investing. I mean, investing could be the most straightforward thing in the world. It really, and Chris will disagree with me on this, but I really think everybody could probably just own one mutual fund there's these mutual funds that have like 7,000 or 8,000 stocks from all around the world in them. And so that's as diversified as it gets. And a lot of people try to sell you on all these different strategies. You really just need that one thing and you're good. So, I just, make things less complicated than if they don't need to be so. And then take that time and put it elsewhere where your passion really is. So that's typically what I tell people.
I think our listeners are getting a sense as to what you do professionally and what you talk about on your show and what you write about. Of course, on the show, we love to talk about the person behind the public platform and get into some of the vulnerable sides, which I know you've been willing to do, which we're grateful for. I know that the connection for you and Chris, and you can tell us the story, has a lot to do with your health diagnosis and how you've been dealing with that. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. Well, so we were talking a little bit before the show, and I think we both agree that Chris is this incredibly authentic and genuine guy, but at the same time, he comes on very, very strong with a lot of love. And once he decides he likes you, you are you are in the circle and you are a best friend. And
whether you want to be or not.
Right. Yeah. It's not necessarily consensual. Like you will, he will kind of make you. He will kind of make you be a part of his circle. Friend. Yeah. And I really admire that. I really respect it. And he reached out to me over LinkedIn, and we did it. We were doing these quarterly chats about business and investing, and but there was not a lot of personal connection to it. And last summer, after I'd known Chris for about a year, and I'd remember that he mentioned he had Crohn's disease, and I was diagnosed. And it's one of those things where it doesn't have to be that serious, but it can be a really serious condition, especially if it's untreated for a long time. And God forbid you go down internet rabbit holes reading about it. I mean, it's true of any medical condition, but you go down and you start reading about it. It's man, there's some people that this has been a terrible, terrible disease for them. And so I was in this real low point where I really, I had been diagnosed, but I hadn't been able to meet with a specialist to actually learn more about how I stood health-wise and what it would mean for me going forward. And so there was a several-week window of just how the hell do you go on with your normal daily life and pretend that everything is okay when, especially somebody like me who is very predisposed to having high levels of anxiety and racing thoughts, how do I focus on daily life? And so I remember being in a real panic after probably reading stuff online that I shouldn't have been reading. And it just clicked in my head. This guy, Chris, who I had, struggled to understand what he wanted from me and whether he was a genuine friend or not. I knew he had always been supportive, and I knew that he always offered unconditional support. And I knew that he said he had dealt with Crohn's his whole life. And so I just texted him. And I remember the way he replied to me, because I think he called me immediately. And he was like, I know how you're feeling right now. I can tell the fact that you're texting me out of the blue about this and the way you wrote your message. I know exactly how you're feeling because I've been there. And he was an incredible mentor for me. And fortunately, I've since learned that, that it is something that with the right treatment, it's very manageable and the treatment options are pretty safe and very effective. And so mentally, I'm in a much better place with it. I just can't say how invaluable it was to have somebody in your kind of lowest, darkest moment reach out a hand and pull you up. And I remember we had another follow-up video call. And I really did not believe him when he said this. But he said to me, Shawn, this is going to be the best thing that ever happens to you. And I'm sitting here being like, dude, I got to take this medication for the rest of my life. And like, I'm going to have more colonoscopies than the average person does. And I'm thinking about all the bad things. And he's like, you are going to be okay. You're not dying. And actually, this is going to make you appreciate life so much more than anyone else your age. You have this massive head start in appreciating the fact that you are alive and are healthy and have many years of life left to live. And for him and for me too, I've since realized that it has been a huge motivator to, not that I ate a bad diet before, but to be really, really strict about eating a very healthy diet, being very conscious of my relationship with food and whether I'm putting things that are nourishing my body and making it healthier into it. And then also, being very strict about exercising. For years, I'd always I was an athlete in high school, but I never did I never went that far because I wasn't serious about weightlifting and gaining weight and bulking up or anything like that you needed to do for football and even basketball. And all through college, I wasn't serious about it. And this was the first moment in my life, or over the last year, I have been going to the gym consistently. I think I've gone every day for the last 10 days, which is if anyone who knows me, that is a crazy record for me because I'm not the kind of person who goes out and works out that way. And not to turn it all into me working out, but the point was, Chris really was onto something. When he kind of, at my lowest point, he said, this is going to be the best thing that happens to you because you're going to appreciate life more, you're going to appreciate your relationships more, and you're just going to improve your overall health. And he was right. Like I said, over the last year, I've been much better about what I eat, and I've been much better about mindfulness and exercise. So there has been a silver lining to it.
That medical anxiety, I've gone through it a few times in recent years. That I think you're right. Someone, this sounds pejorative, someone your age doesn't typically have to think about until, I'm in my mid to late 40s. We'll leave it there. And those experiences start to come up more where you realize the things that are important and on all those things. It's such an easy platitude to say to someone. At least you have your health, which is easy to say to somebody who's 25 and can't pay their rent. And they're like, well, yeah, great. I have my health, whatever. We all have our health at 25. But there are touchstones in our life where, whether it's the loss of somebody close to you, a parent, or someone who's a peer who gets sick young, and suddenly a light bulb goes off that puts things in that perspective. And I agree with Chris in that, luckily, it's something that's treatable, it's something that's manageable, but it also gives you that kick in the ass that the rest of us don't get until we're 45 and we have a colonoscopy and they find something weird. And then you have to wait 2 or 3 weeks to find out test results and stuff like that. That just, it's such an unnatural, kids don't worry about that stuff, And so I think it's a very intense and a very focused couple of weeks, specifically when you're waiting to hear about a test result or you're waiting to hear, what is this pain? And I'm worried about it, And so having someone there, and this has turned into the Chris Panayiotou admiration podcast, but having someone who put themselves out there before that was a thing, because it's easy to be like, oh, dude, I'm here for you in those moments of crisis. But for someone to have put themselves out there before that came up, and then you knew you had that ally there, someone you could turn to, is really important. So, those of us who are on the fence about reaching out to someone or putting yourself out there or being more engaging, it's a good reminder that you could be setting yourself up to be a support system or a touchstone for someone who's really going to need it down the line. So, don't hesitate. Be that supportive friend who goes that extra mile, because you can testify to what a wonderful feeling of support that gave you, right?
Well, look, I'm not a religious person, and I don't invoke, God and fate lightly. But I know Chris is. But I mean, what are the odds that this one person, of all the people I've ever met, who is persistently pushing themselves to be a part of my life, insisting that they need to be a part of my life, for really no reason, would have the exact same medical condition? Like that, I mean, I don't know. The odds of that are humbling to me. It's not even like in the inflammatory bowel disease category. There's two. There's ulcerative colitis and there's Crohn's. So not even just the fact that like the same general condition, but the exact specific variant of the broader condition. It's bizarre. I don't know what to say. It's bizarre.
I love
like,
that. I love that when people are put together that way. The way that Ryan and I became friends, and then we worked together, and then our paths kind of diverged, over the years, and then we've come back together over this idea of talking about mental health and anxiety and coming at it from two different ways. It's I don't want to say it's meant to be, right, but there's definitely a cool kind of cosmic connection that puts people together in ways that maybe they aren't aware why when it first happens.
Well, yeah, and so there are a couple different points I want to make too on top of that. For starters, you talked about kind of when you're young, you don't expect to have medical issues. When you're 25, at least you have your health. And so for me, this all started when I was 22 years old in my senior year of college. I knew that I was having like bloating issues. I knew I was having issues that were not normal. And I was going to doctors and gastroenterologists, and they kept telling me everything was fine. So I kept drinking beer and hanging out with friends and partying and like trying to live a normal life until finally at the end of the end of my senior year in 2021, I had a colonoscopy. And talk about the insecurity and the weirdness of that feeling is like, like 1 week we're like sitting out on the porch, blasting music, drinking beer. And then the next week my friends are like, hey, are you coming out to hang? And it's like, no, actually, like I'm getting a colonoscopy. And like, I remember people that is such a bizarre thing for a young person to go through, because it's, nobody can relate to you. I mean, literally there was like, everybody was like, oh yeah, like I've had the flu before. Like, no, this is not, this is not the flu. Like, and that opened up a whole other can of worms. So like I went through that process and they did a colonoscopy, and they didn't find any evidence of Crohn's. They didn't find any evidence of anything being wrong at all. And so then I was like, then you're in this really confusing situation where you're sitting there like, well, I know I don't feel right. And like, this doesn't really seem, this is like, this doesn't seem completely normal. And so, then that set me down a path of like 2 or 3 years of, telling myself that a lot of this was all in my head. Because what's interesting for me is I don't have the normal Crohn's symptoms. Crohn's is normally like, as Chris put it, like going to the bathroom more. There are people who will find themselves having 20 bowel movements a day. And that's when it's like, okay, it's pretty clear I have Crohn's. That's never been my issue. My issue has always just been like bloating and acid reflux, which aren't necessarily even related to Crohn's at all. So I'm actually considered Crohn's asymptomatic. So I went through this period of like thinking it was all in my head, being told by different doctors like, well, we looked at your colonoscopy results, everything looks fine. To then last year, finally doing another colonoscopy and then saying, hey, there is evidence of Crohn's here. And so it kind of bred into the worst instincts of your hypochondria, where like for several years you're telling yourself, well,
I knew something was wrong.
Yeah, like they say everything is okay, but it doesn't feel like everything is okay. And now they're validating that everything is not completely okay. And so, like I said, for somebody that like struggles with catastrophizing and anxiety, that is just the worst. It would have been so much better if they found it 4 years ago, and I was just like, oh, something is wrong. They found what was wrong. Now it's being treated. But I really traumatized myself over several years of being like, is it this? Is it this? Maybe I'm eating this. Maybe it's because I'm not doing this. And those cycles have been exhausting, draining, and damaging really seriously to my mental health, to where I genuinely think I have a form of like medical PTSD now, where like even this past week I went and had blood work done, and I was on a razor's edge, like fear, like I don't even know what they could have even discovered of something being wrong with you. I didn't know, and that was part of the problem. And so I'm just sitting there like unable to focus and unable to really enjoy life in the way I should be, because I'm having this, like, I'm channeling this emotion from last year when I actually was diagnosed with something. And then I get the blood work back, they tell me everything is fine. And so I don't know. It's something that I'm continuing to process of, like, I have this, I went through like what I would say was a traumatic experience, and I can now very clearly see how it impacts me in different ways, where even just a routine visit to the doctor's office, where they're not doing any tests or anything, I'm still like, my heart rate goes through the roof, my blood pressure spikes, and it's because my body is entering fight or flight mode, thinking that another shoe is about to drop, and I'm about to find out, there's some other issue that I'm dealing with. So yeah.
This is so interesting. There's been a lot of conversation of late in the medical world about the gut-brain connection and how gut health affects your mental health and your general health in really profound ways. The reason I'm bringing it up is because there hasn't been enough conversation, I think, about the mind-gut connection, the other direction. And I've seen this. I worked at a clinic for 3 years doing my clinical hours to licensure at a place called the Missing Piece Center for Anxiety. That was an intensive outpatient clinic where we had people dealing with very high level of anxiety. And what you see as often as any psychological symptom is physical symptoms that are an outgrowth of the anxiety, depression. Yeah, Duck can relate. And so I'm curious to hear, because you mentioned anxiety, catastrophizing in reference to how you're dealing with this, but I kind of want to hear the backstory on those elements of your mental health, because even when there is like a biological reason, a very definitive organic reason why we have an illness, sometimes the mental aspect, the psychological aspect of stress can at least be a contributing factor, if not the cause in the first place. So I kind of want to hear that background.
Yeah. It's not an accident that the highest rates of digestive distress and digestive issues are among people with anxiety and stress disorders. I mean, I don't know the exact statistics, but I've seen it quoted enough that I'm pretty confident that's true. And I mean, I could really, really attest to that being true. Where and this was part of that cycle where I was like, okay, maybe it is all in my head, and like I am really stressed and I do have a lot of anxiety, versus like how much is actually an underlying issue. And in my case, it actually is both. Like I said, I'm asymptomatic for Crohn's, and a lot of the IBS symptoms that I've had are, at least as my gastroenterologists think, primarily stress and anxiety related. So it's this weird thing where on the one hand, and I started the Crohn's treatment, and some of those IBS symptoms I've had haven't changed, even though my levels of inflammation connected to Crohn's have improved. So again, it's kind of like proof that I was having a bad digestive system symptoms. I also had an underlying condition, and it turns out the digestive symptoms are probably mostly linked to my mental health, and the underlying medical condition is mostly kind of a freak thing they discovered that doesn't seem to be that directly involved with the symptoms I have. But yeah, I mean, going back to the symptoms and how your mind-body relationship works, at least for me, it is very, very sensitive for me. Like I know for a fact that like if I have a really stressful week, I'm going to have bloating and other digestive issues. And I've seen it to the extreme. Recently, just a few months ago, like I said, looking at Chris, in so many ways, Chris is like so much further along in this journey than me. He's a couple years older than me, but also like his business is further along and more successful. And also he's dealt with Crohn's his entire life. So he knows, he's been through the emotional ups and downs. For me, in all regards, I'm much earlier along in that process. And so, when it comes to this low point that I hit, I would say in January, so really just a few weeks ago, I was in a place where I was just constantly, like, oh, what if these digestive issues I'm having again? What if this is because of Crohn's? And what if that means the treatment isn't working? If the treatment isn't working, what would that mean? And just, going down this cycle. And then you layer, this is around, right after the holidays. So it's like you layer in holiday stress. I actually got married in December. So like major life change, holidays, medical anxiety. I found out that my mom had Lyme's disease at this time too, which fortunately they caught it early and she's fine. But again, it was just like all of these factors combined together. And it literally felt like my digestive system broke. I couldn't eat anything. I was eating white bread and chicken and I was in like pain and distress. And I was having panic attacks about it. I was like, I can't eat anything. Maybe my Crohn's is a lot more severe than I realized, blah, blah, blah. All of these catastrophizing thoughts. And my now wife, grabs me and shakes me. And she's like, this is because of stress. You're eating the exact same foods you ate 2 months ago and that weren't giving you any trouble. Like you went home for the holidays and you came back like a shell of yourself because anxiety had taken such a toll on you. And I didn't believe her at first. And then I reached out to my gastroenterologist and they're like, yeah, we don't think this is Crohn's related. Like what you're experiencing is not really anything to do with Crohn's. And I was like, okay. And so that gave me enough validation that I could rule out the worst case fears, and then combined with my wife giving me that support, I realized my body and brain are conspiring against me between the digestive issues and my anxiety constantly taking me to the worst place scenarios. And so, I mean, I the amount of meditation I did was ridiculous. I spent almost an entire day meditating, and I have since doing meditation, yoga, even hypnosis, being even more regimented about going to the gym, doing longer workouts, going to the sauna. I mean, I've been doing it all. It's a complete 180. I pulled myself out of that place, and now those symptoms have considerably faded. And to me, I mean, that's the ultimate proof. If anything, I'm eating more foods that should technically trigger digestive distress, but having fewer digestive issues. And so, I mean, I could fully attest to it. I've lived it. I've felt it. I know I'm extremely sensitive to stress. It manifests in my digestive system. And it's something I'm working continuously to process of like, okay, now that I know that, how do I actually manage stress and anxiety so I don't hit another low point like that? And hopefully I won't have a confluence of so many major life events all at one moment. that kind of caused
the perfect storm of holidays and family and all that. Yeah.
It kind of caused my stomach to like tap out.
Was that something that you dealt with like your whole life as a child, that those anxieties? And if so, like when did you first notice that and recognize that? Was there a particularly triggering event or trauma in your childhood that you were like, from that moment on, I was always kind of a jumpy kid, or what? Like, how did that kind of start?
I feel like I always was a bit of a sensitive kid. And like, just, I remember some of my earliest memories are like clinging to my mom's leg and being terrified. Like she's dropping me off at my grandmother's house and I cannot physically bring myself to go to daycare or whatever it was. I had real abandonment issues and I didn't really have any reason to have them as far as I can tell. I mean, I have two, wonderfully supportive and loving parents, but to some extent I came out of the womb just, I don't know, a little clingy, a little not sure of the world. And then I will say though, in terms of early childhood events, I don't think I had it as rough as a lot of people. I grew up in a nice neighborhood. I went to a nice school system, and like I said, I had great parents. But it was a turbulent household. I had two older brothers who had a variety of behavioral issues. And so part of the problem is the fact that they're 7 and 9 years older than me. So they're in high school and I'm in 3rd or 4th grade. And so, they're getting in fights, they're getting caught smoking weed in the bathroom, screaming matches with my parents, police coming by the house, broken windows, a lot of just what you might call just like stupid stuff, but that, was very recurring. And I think that contributed to this feeling of your home, your childhood home where you're growing up, not really feeling like a safe place at times. And I can definitely feel how that has rippled through throughout my life. And when I was in high school, actually, one of my older brothers passed away from a drug overdose. So, again, it's like, for me, I've had these real moments of pain and challenge, whether it's with my brother or with a health diagnosis. And then at the same time, I've struggled with fully processing those things to let them go, so that I can continue on with my life. So it's a work in progress, and I'm not going to pretend like I don't have a lot of work left to go on processing both of those things. But
but you're doing it.
It really, really in the last 12 months is really when the first time I've really seriously made an effort, to process my brother passing away. Mm-hmm. When you're, like I said, I was in high school, and like when you're in high school, you're worried about how your friends perceive you. I was playing 3 sports at the time, so I'm like worried about like baseball practice and then basketball practice and football, and so like you're trying to get ready for the SATs, and you're taking, I pushed myself to do like advanced classes, and I'm doing all this stuff. And I just literally remember a moment where I was like, I don't have time to process this. Like this is brutal. This is very painful, but I don't have time to process this. And I feel maybe some guilt about that in hindsight. But at the time, I just put my head down, and I was even more focused on sports and school. And then I went to college, and it's like, college is kind of a blur in some ways. You're figuring out who you are and making all these friends, and you're doing all these things. And I feel like in the last year or two, kind of now that I've been in the adult world for a little bit and I'm like settled in.
Welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be in the adult world. Yeah, it's
Yeah, it's really spectacular. Let me tell you.
I've really had a chance to actually recognize, like, hey, this was a big. This is a big thing to process, and you have not done the work to process it, and that has only made it probably harder to process. So, I'm still in therapy working through it, and I've made a lot of progress, but I also know that, there are a lot of memories and experiences that I have blocked out, because that's what trauma causes us to do.
I have a couple questions for you. This is kind of a two-parter. First off, I'm sorry for your loss. It's a tragic thing, and at any point in life, a really difficult thing to deal with. And it sounds like you've done the best you can. But also, congratulations on getting married. It sounds like you have a wonderful partner there who is very supportive and able to give you. I mean, the feedback she gave you is like so spot on and perfect, and that's amazing that you have somebody in your life that's in your corner like that. The last year has been kind of when a lot of things have. The shit has sort of hit the fan, so to speak, right? It's like you've had to reckon with a lot of these things.
Is that a Crohn's joke?
Oh, God.
Sorry.
But Chris is right. It's that the worst times in your life can also turn into something positive when you have to deal with something and you find out how you're going to work through that. But you looking back, it sounds like some of those symptoms started, I think you said when you were 20, 22, still in college or just out of college. I'm interested, the first part of the question is that period between when you were a teenager and you lose your brother and you're maybe kind of burying things and not processing them, and when you start having symptoms in your 20s, were there other symptoms of anxiety? Did things come up for you? How were you processing things? Because a lot of times when we bury things, it trickles up in different ways, maybe not literally the pain of the loss because you're not dealing with that. But you might be having depression, you might be having anxieties about other things that are unrelated, and it might be manifesting, of course, maybe later in the physical symptoms, but I kind of want to bridge that gap in terms of what was coming up for you in that time. And then the second part of the question is, amidst all of that, you've still been successful, you went to college, you did all this stuff, you got married, you have a successful podcast. How have you been able to, with all of that going on, be so resilient? Because obviously you're doing something right, even if you weren't dealing with some of those things.
My anxiety has always affected me very physically. And more recently, the last 4 or 5 years, it was in digestive symptoms. But I would say before that, at times in high school and even before my brother passed away, an anxious response for me was very behavioral, and I would pull myself into a cocoon, such that when people who knew me growing up, there were like two very wildly different versions of Shawn that you could get to know. And I can think I know every year, like from like kindergarten through college, I can tell you exactly like what version of myself I was. And it was like, 1 year I was the most popular kid in school. I was extroverted. I was a great athlete. Good, did well on exams, was killing it. And then for some reason, my anxiety, I'd look around and something would spark a wave of feeling like the world around me was not a safe place, whether it was health anxiety or something with my brothers or whatever it was. This feeling that the world was not a safe place. And then I would pull all the way back. And then, the next school year, I didn't talk to anyone. I kept my head down. And so I had these up and down, very cyclical periods in my life where sometimes I was like the embodiment of everything I wanted to be. And then other times for my own, just to feel safe, I had to rip it all out and pull myself back in. And then I'd almost end up kind of rebuilding my life. There in fifth and sixth grade were this period for me where I was really out there and like extroverted and had a lot of friends. And then seventh grade, when I went to middle school, I completely pulled back. And I've noticed for me, it aligns with big transition points in my life. So like elementary school to middle school. And then something similar happened with middle school to high school. And it was funny because when my brother passed away, I knew that I had this tendency to do that. I knew that when I felt scared and unsafe, I pulled back from the world. And I really kind of neutered the potential that I could have. I put a ceiling on myself that was arbitrary. And I knew that was a real risk for me. And that was part of the reason why I really put my head down. It was kind of this coping mechanism. I was like, if I allow myself to slip into a really, really dark place, I may never come out of it, because much smaller things have sent me into very bad places, and this is a big thing. And so, as just a survival mechanism, the next year, this is really funny. If we really want to get into it, but the reason I'm now married to my wife is because of that. I watched a movie. This was right after my brother died, and I was like, I have to get myself out there. I cannot allow myself to pull in. And I watched a movie. We Bought a Zoo with, I think, Matt Damon, and there's a line in it. There's a line in it where he says he asks out his the girl who ends up becoming his wife, and he says all it takes to change your life forever is like 15 seconds of crazy, stupid confidence. And I internalized that because I was at this low point. I was like, I need to do something with just crazy, stupid confidence for 15 seconds. And so like 3 months later, I'm asking this random girl in my history class to homecoming, who I had never talked to. I'd grown up with. We weren't friends. We had nothing in common. I just completely on a whim asked her to homecoming. And she said yes. And now we're married. And so that has been my relationship with anxiety, where it's like on the one hand, it pulls me into these low, dark places. And I know that to fight that, I have to put myself into the world really aggressively, proactively, do the extreme. Go ask out a random girl who you've never talked to just on a whim because of some fantastic ideal you saw in a movie. And I did the same thing when I went to college. I knew, I was like, this is a big transition point for me. I can't allow this moment to pass me by. Like, if I shrink into myself, I'm going to have wasted my college years, and I'm going to have so much regret about that in the future. And so that was a big reason for me why my now wife, like I said, we met in high school, we're friends in high school. She was going to Virginia Tech, which is this big state school, obviously in Virginia. That's where all of our friends were going. And she was like, why are you not coming here? And I was like, this is a school of like 30,000 kids. I'm going to get trampled on and overwhelmed. And my brain, I'm going to get overstimulated, and I'm going to pull myself out. I'm going to have no friends, and I'm going to have I know that sounds dramatic, but I know myself, and I know that that's how I respond to those kind of things. So I ended up going to this small school in North Carolina, and that environment allowed me to be like, again, I knew that if I didn't seize the day, I would slip into the worst impulses of my anxiety and even depression. And so I forced myself to be the big man on campus. I said hi to everybody. Knew me. I said hi to everybody. And it was a small enough school that you could quite literally know everybody. I'm rambling here, but the second part of your question was about, how have I been resilient, I guess, and been able to accomplish things in my career. And, it's a love-hate relationship, I guess, where, I, on the one hand, I feel a lot of pride about what I've been able to do. And then on the other hand, I can't help but think, like, if I didn't have medical issues, I didn't have this anxiety and depression that kind of created these ups and down periods in my life, I could probably have so much more potential. If I felt good all the time and confident all the time, I could accomplish whatever I wanted to put my mind to. And I would say that was a feeling I felt a lot over the last couple of years, where in college, I'm listening to the Investors Podcast, which is the company I now work at, and it's the biggest investing podcast in the world, and I'm a huge fan of it. And then I get the chance to work there, and this is like my dream job. I was working at some big finance company, and I quit that job, and now I'm working for this, what was supposed to be my dream job. I get to make my own hours, I get to podcast, I get to just do whatever I'm interested in. I get to create content based on that. There's nothing better than that. And at the same time, I'm not feeling well. I'm having digestive issues. I have this medical uncertainty that's always hanging over my head, on top of this backdrop of turbulent childhood and a brother passing away and all the anxiety issues that I've always had. There was just this moment where I was like, I kind of got depressed, where I was like, people wait their entire lives to get their dream jobs. And a lot of people never get it. I got my dream job at 22. And I'm sitting there and I'm going, I'm not as happy as I should be. This is my dream. And I'm not appreciating it because I'm resentful for these other things that I feel like are holding me back. So I don't know. I'm not sure that there's a clean ending to that story. It's something I still process, where I love what I do, and I think I have a high motor, and I when I'm able to focus, I can get a lot done with work and accomplish some cool things. And on the other hand, I have frustration and resentment that I'm still processing, where I feel like I could do so much more if I didn't hold myself back with a lot of my anxiety. And then at the same time, I have this recognition of my anxiety is the reason I am where I am. Health anxiety and response to Crohn's is why I'm going to the gym every day and why I'm eating healthier. And as I also told the story, it's why I'm married to my wife now. So
that's Shawn. That's actually what I wanted to touch on. I don't mean to interrupt you. I wanted to get this thought out before it passes by, because just for you, I want to tell you, just as a listener, that's the first thing that came to my head, is that it's almost not a superpower for you, but your awareness of your own situation and your own awareness of the anxiety and the triggers that set it off, and your response to it, whether it's cocooning or whether it's forcing yourself out there, has forced you to confront those obstacles in your life in a way that those of us, and I won't say us because I go through those same things, but some people who are not as in touch with those things do not react that way. So like you say, you go to the gym now and you say, well, if I felt good all the time, I'd go to, but you weren't going to the gym when you felt good. You know what I mean? It is that hurdle that has forced you to confront that stuff. and has now made you a better person. Your anxiety that forces you to cocoon and go into yourself makes your brain go, no, I can't do that. I can't go to Virginia Tech. I'll get lost in that shuffle. I've got to go to a small school. I've got to put myself out there and project this air of I'm everybody's best friend. It's forcing you to become a better person. And it's a really important thing for our listeners to hear, that the anxiety or the mental health issues that we go through in our lives don't have to be roadblocks. They don't have to be things that shut you off from the rest of the world. They can be stepping stones that can force you to break out of those constraints and can make you the person that you imagine yourself to be. You're not cured, you're not better, you don't not deal with anxiety, but you know how to overcome it. You know how to work through it. You know how to recognize it when it comes up and say, all right, this isn't Crohn's. This isn't, I don't have some rare disease that's making me feel this way. I know these symptoms and I know what I have to do to get through it. And it isn't always easy and it doesn't always work. But it's really important that people hear that it's not a barrier to the life that you desire or a better life. It's your reality, and you can either wallow in it and be, miserable and not do anything to overcome it, or you can learn to deal and learn to overcome and meditate and do all the things that you need to do to get to a place where you can still live your best version of a life. So I just want you to know that, just as a layperson, I'm very impressed by the whole process that you've gone through, and I think it's a good lesson for people listening. And I'm sure Ryan would agree that mental health isn't about fixing a problem; it's about learning how to manage and learning what's important and learn all those things together. So
I was going to piggyback on that because I think there's a bigger sort of takeaway from an important discussion that we're having about the nature of life. Life is a mixed bag. Our challenges and our strengths are a mixed bag. And a lot of times the things that are our biggest challenges can lead to or can be our biggest strengths as well. And a lot of times it's hard to see that because we only see it as black or white or one or the other. It's either something that's bad or something that's good. Something
Right.
that's a challenge can be also a strength. And also vice versa, something that has been a strength, for instance, as you mentioned, your coping style, a way in which you work through things that are challenges, can later in life become a challenge. Whereas it helped you at one point, it can become something that's causing you problems. And I mentioned that not to be negative, but to say it's important to recognize the balance between those things and to recognize that we're not stuck in one version of that. It's fluid. We're able to move between something being a challenge and a strength. And even when your strength is something that was, for instance, a lot of people, in your world, I hear a lot of entrepreneurs talking about how, the things that challenged me became my biggest strength because I had to learn how to be resilient. I had to fight through, and I had to be a fighter. I had to be tough. And it's like, that's great. And it helped me achieve a lot of things in life. But then you realize you're still living in this compensation, this thing that I did to deal with pain. And I'm still avoiding the pain and just chasing success or I'm living in my coping style and not looking under the hood to check out the ways in which that might not be serving me in other ways. It might be helping me achieve success, but it's not helping me live my best life or actually be happiest. And so it works in both directions, I think, both in terms of turning something that's negative into a positive by finding strength in the challenge, but also recognizing when our coping styles are not serving us very well. And we just because. I'll put this in the terms of Doug, for you and me, as artists, a lot of times we talk about, a lot of artists will say, well, I can't heal completely, otherwise I can't make great art. It's that age-old
Right.
question, do you need to be in pain in order to create great art? And my argument always is the pain created the impetus to create the art. But once you're making great art, it's not going to be sustainable unless you're healthy. If you continue to live in the ways in which that drove that in the first place, and you don't look inward at how this is now also a detriment to you, then you're actually shooting yourself in the foot. And so the thing that is your biggest strength, which made you a great artist, can also be a problem at a certain point and deserves to be looked at in both ways and honored for what it does that's wonderful. Honor it for the things that you can hold on to that make you a resilient person, a person that can turn a negative into a positive, but also do the work of healing and not avoiding the things that are still challenging.
Yeah. It's a cliche quote, but it goes something like, mental health is a journey, not a destination. And I really believe that to be true. And to what you said about how coping isn't always healthy, even though it can breed success. I mean, again, that was my experience, So, I graduated college, and it's right after this colonoscopy, and I kind of feel liberated because I'm like, okay, well, they didn't find anything on this first one, and like the world is my oyster. And then a couple months later, I'm getting my dream job. And I felt so much insecurity because, again, you get your dream job at 22. And investing, particularly stock investing, is such an intellectual game. And there's a lot of ego involved in it, but it is an intensely intellectual pursuit, to try to take thousands of companies around the world and identify the handful that are going to perform the best over the next decade. That's difficult. And, there are people who spend their whole careers trying to do that, and they're not able to. Consistently. And so I come into it, and I'm in this, I'm with this like prestigious company, and I'm working with people who are like my equivalent of movie stars in like the world, like the nerdy world of like stock podcasting. And I just felt an incredible sense of imposter syndrome. I was like, I don't deserve to be here. I'm not smart enough. I'm not old enough. I don't have the life experience. I haven't really actually worked in finance. I haven't worked in Wall Street. I have no reason to be here. And again, I'm really grateful that my boss did see something in me and was willing to take a chance at me. But at the same time, that imposter syndrome lingered for a long time. I think I've only really kind of recently come to terms with it and gotten over the worst of it in some ways. But that the coping that it led for me was like, I was like, okay, well, everybody's smarter than me and they have more life experience than me. So I just have to read a lot. And I mean, let me tell you, my I do audiobooks. My hours of like audiobook and like podcast listening, especially during that period, are like ridiculous. They're like off the chart. I literally every single second of the day, I was listening to an audiobook or like an investing podcast, like anything that I saw as like enriching and intelligent, and that would somehow make me smarter and deserving of this dream job that I felt that I had stumbled into. And so that was a coping mechanism for me. And it drove me to burnout. Because like I said, I was like for at least a year and a half, every day it was like I'm reading like a very dense academic textbook a week on Audible, and I'm like I have like a dozen different podcasts on all different types of investing that I'm listening to. I'm reading front to back. I'm reading the Wall Street Journal every day. I'm just trying to be this sponge of like all of this information, and I had to realize that was a coping mechanism for like hiding from anxiety. It was a different way of going into the cocoon. It was a different way of like it was like the world is not safe, and I don't feel worthy. I have imposter syndrome. I am just going to so ridiculously overcompensate for that, and having a little bit of that is good. But for me, it was obviously not sustainable because I wasn't really I wasn't allowing myself to enjoy things. And I remember the exact moment, probably after like 2 years of basically torturing myself with forcing myself to constantly learn at every moment so I could pretend to be an expert on everything happening in financial markets. It was a summer evening, and I had like a Volvo convertible at the time. It's like old, like 2008 car that I got from my mom, and a safe place for me was going in for like drives in the countryside. Unfortunately, I live in an area with like lots of beautiful farmland and rolling hills and mountains, and so I take this car and I'm just driving, and this is the first time in what felt like 2 years that I've allowed myself to just have some peace and to go out on a familiar escape, which is, going for a drive in this car down, back roads. And I remember thinking, you have to give yourself permission to relax and to just, you've conditioned yourself to need to be listening to things and to need stimulation, and fine, that's okay. But it doesn't have to be this like intense business and finance and investing stuff 24/7. So I remember it was this like existential religious moment for me where I was like, I'm going to listen to Barstool Sports. I'm going to put on like the most like mindless, stupid sports commentary. I'm going to listen to dudes talk about gambling and drinking and what, just like, whatever it is. And it was a real breakthrough for me, as silly as it sounds, because I really permitted myself, like, you don't have to obsessively be constantly improving yourself, because what you're doing is actually not improving yourself. Like, you think you're improving yourself because you're reading all these books and doing all these things, but it's actually pulling away from your energy and your ability to be present and happy and enjoy life. So yeah, I don't want to say that Barstool Sports is like what saved me, but like permitting myself to indulge in like kind of a mindless consumption just for the sake of it, was a real moment for me that allowed me to release that pattern of coping.
Yeah, you seem to have a really impressive self-awareness that you've been able to notice these guideposts along the way. I'm saying, here's something that I'm doing that's not helping, or here's something that I can do better. I just think it's really impressive. I want to ask one real quick follow-up question. You happen to mention that you said your senior year was around 2021. Mm-hmm. Is that what you said? So that would mean that you were one of those. I mean, we'd be remiss if we didn't take this opportunity to talk to somebody who was going through college during COVID and during the pandemic and during at-home learning. And I mean, I know that was such a stressful moment for an entire generation. That I had a child in kindergarten and first grade, and it was hard enough. What was that like for someone who is struggling to put themselves out there to be a social person, to suddenly have that, now that option is taken away from you? Did that have an impact on you? Did you cope with that well, or was that a setback?
I lived it in a different way than a lot of people in my generation, in that I was kind of at ground zero. I was in Southeast Asia in December 2020. And I was in Thailand for a school trip. And I remember being on the bus, and we were like, it was like 20 kids, and we're like busing to some golden temple, and somebody says, "Oh, I just got this email, and it's this warning that it's a warning to travelers, I think from the State Department, saying that there's this novel virus in China, and the first case has appeared outside of China, in Bangkok, Thailand, which is where we were." And there was this, I think it was a British man, and and he was like critically ill from it. He was like one of the first cases outside of China, and it was like right where we were. And I remember him joking, like, "Oh man, they're gonna lock down the whole world for this. Like, like this is we're gonna live through a pandemic." And we all thought it was a joke, and kind of dismissed it. And then over the next few weeks while we were there, obviously, like, the warnings got more and more intense. And then all of a sudden it was a question of, are we even going to be able to get home? Because at one point we were supposed to go to Hong Kong, and this was not long after Hong Kong had all their protests with China, and there was all these like political issues there. So we rerouted the trip to not be there, but the Hong Kong airport had shut down, and they weren't letting, if you're an American in Hong Kong, you couldn't get back to the US. And we were like, holy crap, like what if that happens in Thailand? We're going to be stuck here. And so then, we saw, like, I saw the beginnings of the lockdown happening there. Everybody's wearing masks. We're like keeping our distance from people, hand sanitizer, all of that stuff. And then I remember flying back to the US, and my dad picks me up at the airport in New York. And I remember saying to him, it's like, this is going to spread here because nobody is taking this seriously. The only screening protocol we went through when we got to the airport, I think at JFK, was they said, "Oh, have you been to China?" And we were like, "No, we haven't been to China." They're like, "Okay, you're good to go. You don't have to quarantine for 2 weeks." I was like, well, my flight was packed full of Chinese nationals, like Chinese students coming to the US. And they're like, "Oh no, we're not worried about it." And I was like, "Okay, this is not exactly like the best containment."
Your medical anxiety.
I know, the best containment logic. So then I went through this really weird period where I'm back in the U.S. in January 2020, and I kind of know that something is brewing and maybe bad, and nobody here is really taking it seriously or paying attention to it. And then so I kind of dismissed it. I was like, okay, well, I guess, life goes on. And then I remember, I was in some science class. I'm sitting in I think it was astronomy class. I'm sitting in my astronomy class, and we get the announcement that the school is shut down for an entire week. And I remember just being stunned. I was like, even I had seen what was happening in Southeast Asia at the time. And even then I still couldn't process. I was like, well, on the other side of the world, now this is like impacting my life. Like I can't hang out with my friends for a week. That was like my biggest concern. And of course, like we went home, and then we stayed home. And so obviously, like your bigger question is like, how did that impact me of living through that? I had an initial period of a lot of anxiety, which I think a lot of people did. And then when I had kind of resigned to the fact that, okay, maybe the world isn't ending, I actually had one of the best periods of my life. I got to spend a couple months living at home with my parents over the summer in 2020 before I went back to school that fall. And I just remember thinking, this is probably the last time I'll ever truly get to just be a kid again. I have no responsibilities. There's no school. There's nothing that's going on. I don't have a job. Couldn't have a job if I wanted one. I have no responsibilities, and I get to just wake up on a Monday, and my mom's making pancakes, and I get to just hang out and be home. And I just remember thinking, like, my parents are a bit older. I just remember thinking, like, this is such a special opportunity. Like, I remember being so aware of this at the time. I'll never be able to experience this again. Like, I have this unblemished time of several weeks and months to just live at home and be a kid. So I fully embraced it. And I use that time in a much more healthy way. I know we talked about like obsessively learning before. During this time, I use it as a way to like learn about things in a more healthy way. I read a lot of books that stimulated my curiosity to later figure out what I'm kind of more passionate about now. So in a lot of ways, I'm really, really grateful for that period. I don't know if that's the answer maybe you're expecting or how a lot of people feel.
It's fascinating to me. Your self-awareness is mind-boggling to me. That you can be in a moment and go, this is important. I'm going to need to use this time. I think it's great. You're going to be okay, kid.
So I was really grateful to have those experiences with my parents, to do some deeper learning. And then also, the weirder thing was like, for my first 3 years of college, like I was in a fraternity, and a lot of it was like, you go, like you have parties. It's like these kind of like arbitrary social situations. We're all going to hang out here, but like there's not meaningful connection happening. And what was really interesting about our senior year of college, and it was a good thing that it happened. I'd have totally opinion if it happened freshman year of college versus senior year. But senior year, I knew who a lot of my friends were, and I knew I wanted to spend time with them. And so I wasn't going to parties or going to things to meet people. Like I already had friends. And so, we couldn't have parties. We couldn't go to bars. We couldn't do, big social things. And that actually led us to do really deep bonding. And like, I now have 2 of my best friends in the world who I expect to be friends with until the day I die. I became close with in a way that I couldn't have become close with if it weren't for COVID. Like one of them, one of my buddies, we got COVID together during Thanksgiving. So we missed our family Thanksgiving. We were stuck at school for a week, and we had our own Thanksgiving dinner together, and we played chess every afternoon and we went on like long walks together, and like just experiences that like you wouldn't really have during the normal chaos and busyness of school. So there are a lot of things about that period that I'm really, really grateful for. The friendships that came out of it, the time with my parents, and the chance to actually spend some time figuring out who I am and what I'm interested in. I honestly think it was one of the best periods of my life. I speak about it nostalgically. I really, 2021, 2022, where like life was kind of restricted, but not fully restricted. Some of that was more of a nuisance, maybe, for lack of a better word. But 2020 itself, this year of like, I don't have any guilt about missing out on doing things because it's not even an option. And I can just fully indulge in what's here and around me and in myself. It was a very enriching experience for me.
Right on, man.
That's amazing. I think for me it was kind of a mixed bag, but I can relate to what you're saying because it was one of the more challenging times just dealing with at first what felt nice actually to have some space, and I enjoy isolation to a certain degree, but then at a certain point it was too much isolation for too long. But I look back at that time and I wrote my book during quarantine, the first draft of it. I started seeing clients as a therapist and got a crash course in mental health while we're all dealing with a worldwide pandemic. Talk about education, I mean,
Yeah.
so there was so much that came from that. I think it's just what you're describing is a testament to the idea that life is a mixed bag in that way. That's like sometimes even the worst things can bring some really positive things if you're willing to see them. And it sounds like you have been very willing to look for the ways through those tough times to take something of value from it. And that obviously has served you well thus far and will continue to. So, I mean, Shawn, this has just been a really fascinating and inspiring conversation. I thank you so much for your willingness to be very open and vulnerable and just share all of these aspects of your story. It's been enlightening.
It's been a lot of fun, and I'm grateful for, to say like the cliche thing of maybe somebody will get some value out of it, but I really hope so. So thanks for giving me the chance to tell that story.
All right. Well, Shawn O'Malley has been our guest this week on the Harder to Breathe podcast. Another great conversation. We have new episodes every Tuesday. You can find it, the videos on YouTube, and of course the audio on any major podcast platform. Tune in next Tuesday for a new episode. We'll see you next time right here on the Harder to Breathe podcast.